Realm of Ruins, Chapter 2, Corey. Corey, Balon, lay back against the thin cushions of his cot, feeling the warmth of the girl's naked skin atop him, her fingers tracing lazy patterns down his chest. The other two girls lounged nearby, still flushed and drowsy, tangled up in sheets and shadows. He could feel her warm breath on his neck, her tongue wet against his skin, as she murmured something he didn't bother to catch. Words weren't really necessary at moments like these. He smiled, his dark eyes half-lidded, letting her hair tickle his face as he sank deeper into the comfort of his own personal escape. The wine pitcher lay empty beside the bed, long since drained in the hours that had blurred one into the next. A slow, heady symphony of pleasure and forgetting. Corey's dark hair fell messily over his face, strands sticking to his damp skin, and he brushed them back, only for her to lean down and pull him back into a languid, teasing kiss. Her body was warm and soft, and for the moment, that was all he needed. And that was when Boris entered. The tent flap whipped open, bringing with it a gust of cool dawn air, pale light filtering in to paint the scene in soft gold and shadow. Corey blinked, looking up lazily, unconcerned, though the girl on top of him squeaked, reaching for a stray scrap of cloth to cover herself. Boris' silhouette filled the doorway, arms crossed, his face a mask of resigned exasperation. "Corey," Boris sighed, voice dry as a desert. "Father's expecting us. The war council started." Corey only grinned, unfazed. He slid his hands slowly up the girl's back, pulling her closer for a lingering kiss, just because he could. He felt her giggle against him, a thrill of defiance in the face of his brother's disapproval. Then he glanced at Boris, barely suppressing a smirk. "You'd think they could manage one meeting without me." Boris' expression barely shifted, though there was a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "If you're not coming, I'll tell him you're indisposed, enjoying yourself." "Oh, I'm coming," Corey replied, with a wicked glint in his eye, pulling himself up, leaving the warmth of the cot and the girl's disappointed pout. He moved slowly, stretching, letting the cool dawn air prickle his skin as he threw on his leather armor. He could feel the girl's eyes on him as he moved, their laughter fading behind him, as he grabbed his sword and shrugged it over his shoulder. Outside, the dawn was pale and misted, the sun still low on the horizon, casting a faint, eerie glow over the camp. Corey shivered slightly, feeling the last remnants of warmth leaving his skin as he stepped into the open, Boris' tall figure waiting beside him. The world felt stark and cold after the heat of the tent, a reminder of what lay ahead, grim duty, death waiting just beyond the horizon. But for Corey, that was all the more reason to enjoy every fleeting pleasure he could snatch in between the bloodshed. He was the second son, the one with no expectations on his shoulders. And if the world wanted him to be more than that, well, the world would just have to keep waiting. Boris glanced at him sideways as they made their way toward the command tent, dawn creeping over the landscape. "One day, you'll run out of excuses," he said, a hint of a smile softening his usual stern expression. Corey only laughed, sliding an arm around his brother's shoulders. "Not if I play my cards right." Boris shook his head, a trace of exasperation breaking through his usual sternness. "You think it's all a game, don't you? Life, duty, even this war," Corey scoffed, shoving his hands into his pockets as they walked. "You know, Boris, it doesn't have to be as bleak as you make it. We're only here because Father wants us to be here. You're the family pride. I'm just, well, let's call me the family's attempt at variety." "Father expects more from you, Corey. We all do," Boris replied, his tone firmer. "The men see you. They look to you because you're a Balon. When you spend your time indulging, it's more than just your own reputation on the line." Corey bristled, his easygoing smile fading slightly. I didn't ask for any of this, Boris. I didn't choose to be born into a family that demands a fight every day. Maybe I'm just tired of pretending to care about things I don't. Maybe it's time you grew up, Boris said quietly, his voice cold but edged with a hint of sadness. Whether you want this life or not, it's yours. And there are men, good men, who would give anything to trade places with you. They walked on in silence, the tension between them hanging heavy in the misty air. Corey knew his brother was right, of course. He always was, but the knowledge only made the weight of expectation feel heavier. As they neared the command tent, Corey felt the familiar weight of duty pressed down on him, as it always did in moments like these. Inside, their father stood by the war table, maps spread out before him. Lords Oswald, Harold, and Oric were speaking in hushed tones, but as the brothers entered, Beorn raised his head. "My lords," Beorn said, his tone even yet insistent, "can I have a moment with my sons?" Oswald, Harold, and Oric nodded, each sparing Corey a brief, unreadable look, before they slipped out into the misty dawn. When the tent flap fell, a heavy silence settled over the space, thick with the weight of unsaid words. Beorn's gaze locked onto Corey, and for a moment he said nothing, only letting his eyes run over him, the lingering smugness in Corey's expression. Finally he spoke, his voice hard as iron. "Do you think this is a game, Corey? A place to entertain yourself while the rest of us bear the weight?" Corey's grin faltered, but he leaned back, crossing his arms in defiance. "I know my duty, Father, but we both know Boris is the one meant to carry the family name. I'm just here for the show." Beorn's face darkened, and he stepped forward, the force of his presence filling the tent. "This isn't about names or legacies, Corey. It's about survival. Every man here fights for the men next to him. And what do you fight for? A few moments of pleasure, while the rest of us bleed?" Corey clenched his jaw, but the flash of irritation was quickly masked by his usual smirk. "If I'm to die, I'd rather enjoy the time I've got left." Beorn's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You think your life is yours to waste? Every soldier here relies on the man beside him, and you would make them doubt if they can rely on you. You dishonor our family every time you shirk your duty. If you can't find a reason to fight for them, find a reason to fight for yourself. Or perhaps," Beorn's voice took on a colder edge, his gaze unflinching, "perhaps I should find a purpose for you myself. A marriage, perhaps. Someone with enough patience and strength to keep you in line." Corey's face fell, his defiance faltering. "You wouldn't try me," Beorn replied, his tone as unyielding as steel. "If you cannot uphold the family's honor here, I'll see you fulfill it in another way, whether you like it or not." Corey swallowed, a flicker of something raw beneath the defiance. His father's words hit harder than he'd let on, and he looked away, his voice quieter. "You've always known I'm not like Boris. I don't fit into this world the way you want me to." Beorn's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "You may not be Boris, but you're still a Balon. The men don't need another warrior. They need a leader who stands with them, who doesn't shrink from the weight that we all carry. Find a way to be that leader, or so help me, Corey. I'll make that marriage arrangement myself." The silence that followed was thick, Corey's defiance all but drained. He nodded, the smirk fading, as he glanced at the war table, the maps scattered across it, each line and mark representing lives, plans, struggles he'd never truly given a second thought. He could almost hear Boris's voice echoing in his mind, telling him how much those lines cost, how every man who fell was another debt they owed. A strange bitterness crept into his chest as he looked at his father and brother, these two men who had built their lives around duty, who thrived on it, who seemed to live and breathe for every responsibility placed upon them. In a way, he envied them. But the thought of becoming like them, shackled by expectation and burden, it terrified him. And yet, as much as he wanted to reject it all, there was a tiny spark of something else, a whisper that lingered under all his defiance and bravado, a part of him that wondered what it would be like to be someone his father could be proud of. "Dismissed," Bjorn said, his tone colder, final. Corey hesitated, his pride warring with the resentment, and something else he couldn't quite name. Without another word, he turned and pushed through the tent flap, leaving his father and the weight of expectations behind him, at least for now. The mist outside was thick and cold, wrapping around him like a shroud. Corey took a deep breath, letting the chill settle in his lungs, trying to clear his mind. Somewhere, just out of reach, was the memory of the warmth he'd felt earlier, the laughter, the sense of freedom he clung to so desperately. But the moment was gone, lost in the haze of duty and the shadow of his family's expectations. Boris emerged from the tent behind him, his gaze steady, as if he were trying to read the conflict in Corey's eyes. "You know he's right, don't you?" he asked, his voice softer now, without the edge of their earlier exchange. Corey forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "Right or not, I don't see myself wearing the chains you and Father seem so eager to bear." Boris studied him, his expression thoughtful, almost sad. "They're only chains if you see them that way. For me, it's just purpose, a reason to keep going, even when the world feels as dark as it does now." Corey looked away, the familiar surge of frustration rising in his chest. "I don't need purpose, Boris. I need to feel alive, and if I can only find that in moments of pleasure, then maybe that's just who I am." Boris shook his head slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "I just hope, for your sake, you're wrong." They stood there for a moment, brothers divided by more than just responsibility. Corey could feel the distance between them like a chasm, and though he knew he could bridge it, step into the role that was expected of him, he couldn't bring himself to take that step. Not yet. Thank you for tuning in to Realm of Ruins. Don't forget to like and follow to keep the story going.